The 11th of March 2011 started like any other Friday in Japan. People were at work, kids were in school. Everything felt completely normal. Then, in just a few minutes, that normal life disappeared. A massive earthquake shook the country, and many people believed they had already survived the worst. But they were wrong. The earthquake wasn't the real disaster. It was only the first chapter. What came next was far more terrifying: a tsunami powerful enough to erase entire towns, followed by a nuclear crisis that caught the world's attention. And here's the question that still makes people think today. If one of the most advanced earthquake warning systems on Earth couldn't stop this tragedy, what chance does anyone really have? In this video, we'll walk through exactly how one disaster triggered another, why every minute mattered, and how a single day changed Japan and the world forever. Looking back now, it's hard not to wonder if nature was trying to warn everyone. 2 days before the disaster, on the 9th of March 2011, a magnitude 7.2 earthquake struck off Japan's northeastern coast. It was strong enough to shake buildings and get people's attention for a while. But in Japan, earthquakes happen all the time. Most people saw it as just another normal day in a country that lives with constant seismic activity. The shaking didn't stop there. Over the next several hours, more earthquakes hit the same area. Several of them were stronger than magnitude 6. Scientists recorded the activity. Emergency officials followed their procedures. The monitoring system stayed online and did exactly what they were designed to do. From the outside, everything looked under control. For the people living there, life moved on almost immediately. Trains kept running. Businesses reopened. Parents picked up their kids. Stores stayed busy. After years of living with earthquakes, people had learned not to panic every time the ground moved. It had become part of everyday life. That's probably the hardest lesson in this story. When something happens often enough, we stop seeing it as a warning. We tell ourselves we've seen this before. We assume tomorrow will be just like yesterday. That feeling of familiarity can quietly turn into confidence, and confidence can easily become complacency. The truth is, nature doesn't always announce its biggest moments with one dramatic event. Sometimes, it starts with small signals, a few unusual tremors, a pattern that doesn't seem important at first. Looking back, those earthquakes on March 9 weren't random events. They were the first signs that enormous pressure had been building deep beneath the Pacific Ocean for centuries. But no one could see the full picture yet. The warning systems detected earthquakes exactly as they were supposed to. Scientists watched the data. Residents trusted the technology and returned to their routines. Nobody imagined these tremors were only the opening act. The real disaster hadn't even begun. In less than 48 hours, Japan would face one of the most devastating natural disasters in modern history, and everything people thought they understood about safety would be tested in ways no one expected. At exactly 2:46 p.m. on March 11, everything changed. Deep beneath the Pacific Ocean, a magnitude 9.1 megathrust earthquake broke loose. It wasn't just another earthquake. It was one of the strongest ever recorded in human history. Within seconds, Japan's earthquake warning system detected the first seismic waves. Alerts flashed across televisions and cell phones. High-speed trains slammed on their brakes. Factories automatically shut down. Schools told children to get under their desks. The technology worked exactly as it was supposed to. But there was one thing it couldn't do. It couldn't stop what was coming. Then the ground exploded into motion. The shaking wasn't over in a few seconds like most earthquakes. It kept going. 10 seconds, 30 seconds, a full minute, then another. By that point, people weren't asking if it would stop. They were wondering if it ever would. For nearly 6 long minutes, the ground rolled beneath their feet. Buildings bent back and forth. Streetlights swayed like tree branches in a storm. Furniture crashed across living rooms. Windows rattled so hard they sounded ready to shatter. People stumbled as they tried to stay on their feet. Many simply froze, unable to believe what they were feeling. Near the epicenter in Miyagi Prefecture, the shaking reached the highest level on Japan's intensity scale. But the earthquake didn't stay there. It spread across almost the entire country. Tokyo, hundreds of miles away, saw skyscrapers swaying for what felt like forever. Office workers watched ceilings shake above them. Elevators stopped. Phones rang nonstop. Even in Osaka and other cities, far from the epicenter, people felt the ground moving beneath them. The earthquake was so powerful that instruments around the world recorded it. Scientists later confirmed that it shifted parts of Japan several feet to the east and even moved Earth's axis by a small amount. It's hard to imagine an event so powerful that it literally changed the planet, but that's exactly what happened. When the shaking finally stopped, many people took a deep breath. They looked around and saw damaged buildings, broken roads, and frightened neighbors. It was terrifying, but they believed they had survived the worst. That thought lasted only a few minutes. What no one could see was the ocean. Far offshore, the earthquake had pushed an enormous volume of seawater upward. While people were checking on their families and stepping outside to assess the damage, a much bigger disaster was already racing toward the coast. The earthquake had ended, but the real nightmare had only just begun. For a few minutes after the earthquake, people thought they had made it through the worst part. They checked on their families, stepped outside, and looked at the damage around them. Some even felt relieved that they were still alive. But out in the Pacific Ocean, something much bigger had already begun. Just minutes after the shaking stopped, Japan's meteorological agency issued a tsunami warning. At first, officials estimated waves of around 20 feet. That was serious, but it was also a height many coastal communities believed they had prepared for. Seawalls had been built. Evacuation plans were in place. It seemed like the country had done everything it could. Then, new data started coming in. A GPS buoy offshore detected the ocean rising much faster than expected. Within moments, officials realized the first forecast was wrong. This wasn't an ordinary tsunami. They quickly raised the warning, predicting waves over 30 feet in some areas. Even that turned out to be an underestimate. When the tsunami reached the coast, people didn't see a normal wave rolling onto the beach. They saw what looked like an entire wall of water moving across the land. It didn't crash and disappear. It just kept coming. Cars floated away like toys. Fishing boats were thrown onto streets. Houses were ripped from their foundations and carried away with everything inside. Some of the hardest-hit towns had already lived through deadly tsunamis decades earlier. They had learned painful lessons from the past. Massive seawalls had been built to protect the coastline. People trusted those barriers because they had worked before. But this time was different. The waves climbed over the seawalls as if they weren't even there. In some places, the water rose higher than 3-story buildings. Entire neighborhoods vanished within minutes. Roads disappeared. Bridges collapsed. Ports were destroyed. Everything people believed would protect them was simply overwhelmed by the size and force of the water. What makes this disaster so heartbreaking is that Japan wasn't unprepared. It had some of the best warning systems, engineering, and emergency planning in the world. The problem wasn't a lack of preparation. The problem was that nature created a disaster bigger than the one people had planned for. That's the lesson this day left behind. We often prepare for the last disaster because it's the one we understand. But nature doesn't repeat itself exactly. Sometimes it writes a completely new story. And on the 11th of March 2011, that story became one of the deadliest tsunamis in modern history, changing thousands of lives in less than an hour. The earthquake was terrifying. The tsunami was devastating. But for the people who lived through that day, what they remember most are the moments that came in between, the decisions they had to make, the people they tried to save, and the loved ones they never saw again. As the tsunami warning spread, thousands of people ran for higher ground. Some grabbed their children, others stopped to help elderly neighbors who couldn't move fast enough. Nobody knew exactly how much time they had. They only knew they couldn't stay where they were. In many towns, schools became emergency shelters. Teachers gathered students, trying to keep everyone calm while the ground was still shaking. They believed they were making the safest choice. Then, someone shouted that the tsunami was coming. Within minutes, the water reached places that were never supposed to flood. Some school buildings were completely surrounded. Hallways turned into rivers. Classrooms filled with water. Teachers didn't think about themselves. They carried children, pulled them through broken windows, and fought the current with everything they had. Some saved lives, others never made it home. Across the coast, families were facing impossible choices. Some parents searched desperately for their children, while children searched for their parents. Husbands and wives were separated in the chaos. Brothers and sisters called each other's names, hoping for an answer that never came. For many survivors, the hardest part wasn't surviving the wave, it was what came after. They stood on hillsides, watching entire neighborhoods disappear beneath the water. Homes they had lived in for decades were simply gone. Streets they knew by heart no longer existed. Everything that had made life feel normal vanished in less than an hour. Some people walked back days later hoping to find family members. Instead, they found silence. A photograph, a shoe, a piece of furniture. Small reminders of lives that had been there only hours before. Those were often the only things left behind. That's what makes this disaster so difficult to understand. It wasn't just about buildings collapsing or towns being destroyed. It was about ordinary people whose lives changed forever in a single afternoon. Many survived the tsunami itself, but they carried losses that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Even today, when survivors talk about March 11, they rarely begin with the earthquake or the wave. They talk about the faces they remember, the hands they couldn't hold on to, the people they wish they had one more chance to see. And maybe that's the part of this story we'll never fully understand unless we've lived through something like it ourselves. By the time the tsunami finally began to pull back, many people thought the nightmare was over. They had no idea another disaster was already unfolding just 100 miles away. This one couldn't be seen from the shore, and that made it even more frightening. At the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, the earthquake had already knocked out the main power supply. That was serious, but not yet a disaster. The emergency diesel generators started automatically, just as they were designed to do. For a short time, everything seemed under control. The reactors were still being cooled, and the staff believed they could manage the situation. Then, the tsunami arrived. The waves were far higher than anyone had planned for. They crashed over the plant's seawall and flooded the entire site. Within minutes, the emergency generators were underwater. Electrical systems failed one after another. Suddenly, the plant went dark. That was the moment everything changed. Without electricity, the cooling systems stopped working. Inside the reactors, temperatures kept climbing. Pressure continued to build. Every passing minute made the situation more dangerous. Engineers tried everything they could think of, but many of the tools they depended on no longer worked. They weren't just fighting broken equipment anymore. They were racing against time. As officials realized how serious the situation had become, evacuation orders expanded again and again. Families packed whatever they could carry and left their homes without knowing if they would ever come back. Many believed they would return in a few days. For thousands of them, that day never came. Then came the explosions. Hydrogen gas built up inside the reactor buildings until the pressure became too much. One explosion ripped through the first reactor, blowing apart the upper section of the building. Not long after, another explosion hit a different reactor. Images of those massive blasts spread across television screens around the world, and suddenly, this was no longer just Japan's tragedy. It had become a global crisis. People everywhere started asking the same question. How far could this go? The fear wasn't only about the damaged reactors. It was about something invisible. Radiation. You couldn't see it. You couldn't smell it. But everyone understood the danger it could bring. That uncertainty created panic far beyond Japan's borders. Looking back, it's clear that the earthquake and tsunami were natural disasters. Fukushima was different. It became a chain reaction that nobody expected to unfold this quickly. One event triggered another, and then another. Before long, the world was watching one of the most serious nuclear accidents in history. It was a painful reminder that sometimes the greatest danger isn't the disaster we can see. It's the one that begins after we think the worst is already over. As the situation at Fukushima grew worse, most people were told to leave. That was the only safe choice. But not everyone walked away. A small group of engineers, technicians, and plant workers stayed behind. Today, the world knows them as the Fukushima 50. They understood exactly what they were facing. Every hour they remained inside the plant meant more exposure to dangerous levels of radiation. They knew the risks. They knew they might never return home, but they also knew that if they left, the disaster could become far worse. So, they stayed. Working inside damaged buildings, often with limited equipment and almost no certainty that their efforts would succeed, they kept searching for ways to cool the reactors and prevent an even larger release of radiation. Every decision carried enormous pressure. Every minute mattered. It's easy to call them heroes now, but they were ordinary people with families waiting for them. They were fathers, husbands, co-workers, and friends. Like anyone else, they were scared. The difference was that they chose to keep going anyway because millions of lives could depend on what they did next. Their work didn't erase the disaster, but it helped prevent an even greater catastrophe. Even so, the damage was already enormous. Entire communities were forced to evacuate. Hundreds of thousands of people left their homes, many believing they would return within days. For countless families, those days turned into years. Some never moved back at all. The economic impact was staggering. Rebuilding towns, cleaning up radioactive contamination, and decommissioning the damaged reactors would take decades and cost hundreds of billions of dollars. Combined with the earthquake and tsunami, the disaster became the most expensive natural disaster in recorded history. But when people remember the 11th of March 2011, they don't remember it only because of the numbers. They remember it because it changed the way the world thinks about risk, preparation, and the limits of technology. This wasn't just the story of an earthquake. It was a lesson that even the most advanced country can't control everything. Nature will always have the final word. What we can control is how we prepare, how we respond, and how we stand together when everything around us is falling apart. And maybe that's why the story of Fukushima still matters today. Not because it reminds us how powerless we are, but because it shows what ordinary people are capable of when they're asked to face the impossible. More than a decade has passed, and Japan has rebuilt much of what was lost. New roads were built, cities came back to life, businesses reopened. On the surface, it looks like the country has recovered, but some scars never truly disappear. Thousands of people are still missing. Many families never got the chance to say goodbye. Around Fukushima, the effects of the nuclear disaster are still being felt, reminding us that some consequences last far longer than the day they begin. If there's one lesson this story leaves behind, it's this. No matter how advanced our technology becomes, nature will always be stronger. We can't control it, but we can choose how well we prepare, how quickly we respond, and how we help each other when everything changes in an instant. What part of this story stayed with you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.